The night he begged me to stay, I was already packing my second bag. My hands were moving fast, pushing clothes into the suitcase with more force than care. The room around me looked like a storm had passed through. Open drawers, scattered shirts, a photo frame face down on the floor. My heart was not racing. It was quiet, focused. There was no shaking, no crying. Not anymore. I had cried enough. While he stood in the hallway, silent and still, I moved with purpose. Not because I knew exactly where I was going, but because I knew I could not stay. Not after everything. Not now, when the change I had prayed for was finally happening. But for the wrong reason. He was only changing because I was leaving. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds. A storm was coming, and I could hear the wind pushing against the windows. But the storm inside had already passed. I had waited through its worst hours, hoping for peace. And now that it was finally quiet, I realized peace had not come from him. It had come from my decision to walk away. Only 3 months before, I was still trying to make it work. I used to wait for him to notice. I would dress nicely, prepare dinner, light candles. I would ask about his day and listen, even when my own was heavy with stress. He would answer with one-word replies, sometimes with nothing at all. His eyes were always somewhere else, on his phone, on the TV, or lost in a silence that felt like a locked door between us. He had stopped seeing me, but I was still there, still trying. And then one night, it all changed. Not because he confessed, because he forgot to hide it. He left his phone on the table. A message appeared. My eyes caught it before my heart could warn me. A woman's name I did not recognize. A sentence that made my stomach turn. I had read it twice, then turned away. I did not confront him. Not that night. Not with words. I simply began to fade. I smiled less. I stopped asking. I moved through the days like a quiet guest in my own home. He noticed. A little. He started asking if I was okay. He offered to make dinner. He sent me sweet messages like he used to in the early days. But it was already too late. His change came like flowers after winter. Beautiful, yes, but arriving long after the garden had died. He brought me coffee in bed. He left notes on my desk. He talked about the future, about fixing things. He even booked us a weekend trip. But I was already gone. It was not sudden. It was slow. The way some trees take weeks to fall, even after being cut. My roots had been pulling away quietly for months, and the moment he started trying again, I felt like a stranger to myself. His words, once so important, now landed without weight. Then came the night he planned a full dinner. My favorite meal, soft music, candles lit again. He was kind, gentle, thoughtful. But I did not feel loved. I felt observed, like he was trying to read a book he had never bothered to open before. After that night, I knew it was time. So I waited until he was out the next day. I began to pack, not in anger, not with tears, with calm, with finality. I folded each piece of clothing as if I was tucking away a past life. That was the moment he came home early. He stood in the doorway, holding a grocery bag, his eyes wide with panic. But I did not stop packing. I kept going, slow and steady. His voice broke behind me, words I had longed to hear, promises, regrets, apologies, talk of therapy, change. But my hands never paused, because I had finally learned that change means nothing when it arrives after the damage is done. I zipped the bag closed, picked it up, and walked past him. His arms did not reach for me. They stayed frozen at his sides, like he knew. I stepped outside. The wind was cold, strong against my face, but I welcomed it. I was not running from him. I was walking back to myself. I walked until my legs began to ache. I had no destination, only the need to move. The air outside was heavy, filled with the scent of rain and wet leaves. I passed quiet streets, empty shops, and the familiar park where we used to sit together. I did not stop. I could not stop. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. I was not ready to feel, not yet. By the time I reached the small hotel at the edge of the city, the sky had opened and the rain began to fall. The receptionist handed me a key without asking many questions. I was grateful for that. I climbed the stairs slowly, letting the weight of the suitcase pull my arm downward. The hallway was narrow, the lights soft and yellow. Room 206. I stepped inside, locked the door, and let the silence hold me. The room smelled like old wood and something sweet. I sat on the bed and looked at my hands. They were red from carrying the bag, trembling slightly now. I placed them on my knees and closed my eyes. The storm outside grew louder. Inside, I was still. That night, I did not cry. I thought I might. I thought the sadness would rise and spill over, but it did not. What I felt was something else, a dull ache, like the last breath of something that had been dying for a long time. In the morning, I woke early. The bed was too soft. The air was cold. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the world waking up outside the window. Cars, a dog barking, a child laughing, life going on. I made tea in the small kettle near the sink. I held the warm cup in my hands and watched the steam rise. The heat touched my face, and I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, not yet, but something like it, like permission to begin again. He sent messages, many. At first they were full of confusion and panic, then guilt, then love. He wrote that he missed me, that he was ready to change, that he already had. He asked for one more chance, said he was reading books, meeting with someone, writing down his thoughts. But I did not answer, because I remembered the woman I had become in that house. Quiet, careful, always wondering, always hoping, always waiting for him to see me again. I had waited through birthdays and anniversaries. I had waited through silence and distance. I had waited even when it hurt. And when he finally looked, truly looked, I was no longer standing in the same place. The change he offered came with flowers, letters, and soft words. But change, when it is real, does not beg. It does not arrive only after losing everything. True change happens when someone sees their wrongs before they cause damage. When they choose to grow not because they fear losing you, but because they understand they have already lost something in themselves. I spent 3 days in the hotel. I walked in the mornings, read in the afternoons. I wrote in a notebook I bought from a corner shop. Small thoughts at first, observations, feelings, then memories. I wrote about how I had stopped singing in the kitchen, how I had started checking his phone when he was in the shower, how I would lie awake at night, listening to his breathing, wondering where he had been. Writing gave me back my voice. On the 4th day, I checked out. The receptionist smiled politely. I smiled back. It was the first real smile I had felt in weeks. I did not go back home. I went to my sister's. She lived 2 towns away near the coast. Her house was quiet, full of books and soft blankets. She made soup. She asked no questions. I slept on her couch and listened to the sea through the open window. I let myself rest. When I finally called him, it was not because I had changed my mind. It was because I wanted to end it with my own voice, not with silence. He answered quickly, like he had been holding his phone all day. His voice was soft, careful, hopeful. I spoke slowly, clearly. I told him I had loved him deeply, that I had believed in them, that I had given everything I had. But love is not a one-way street, and by the time he started walking toward me again, I had already crossed to the other side. He listened. He did not interrupt. He cried, but I did not. I hung up the phone and placed it on the table. My sister was in the kitchen making tea. The sound of the kettle whistling filled the space between us. I walked over, took a deep breath, and opened the window wider. The sea was shining in the distance. The sky was beginning to clear. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I stayed at my sister's house for 2 weeks. The days passed gently, each one lighter than the last. I took long walks by the sea, watched waves rise and fall, and listened to the wind. It was strange how quiet could feel safe again. No tension in the air, no careful words, no hidden fears beneath the surface of ordinary conversations. Each morning I made tea and sat in the same chair by the window. I did not check my phone. I no longer waited for his messages. They had stopped anyway. Maybe because he had finally understood, or maybe because he had given up. Either way, I was not reaching back. My sister gave me space. She never asked for details. She let me be. In the evenings, we cooked together, listened to soft music, and shared small stories. Not about him, about books, about childhood, about the garden. I remembered how much I had missed that kind of safety, not physical, but emotional. Being with someone who did not drain me, who did not ask me to shrink or shape myself to fit their needs. One afternoon, I opened a box of old photographs. I had not planned to. It was just there, under her coffee table, full of pictures from our childhood. Us at the beach, covered in sand. Us in our school uniforms. Us with our parents on the front porch, before life became complicated. In one photo, I was holding a small cake with pink candles. I must have been 10. My face was lit up, eyes wide, smile real. I stared at that photo for a long time. That girl had been full of dreams. She believed in love, in kindness, in forever. Where had she gone? I placed the photo on the table and looked out the window. The sea was calm that day, pale blue, peaceful. I realized I had not felt like myself in years, not since the early days with him, when everything was new and full of promise, before the small cracks began to show. Before I started excusing behavior that made me uncomfortable, before I lost count of the nights I cried quietly in bed, pretending to be asleep. Healing did not come in one moment. It came slowly through ordinary things, the taste of tea, the warmth of my sister's voice, the steady sound of waves. Bit by bit, the weight began to lift. One morning, I picked up my notebook again. I wrote about the girl in the photo, about how she had loved writing stories, dancing in the living room, staying up late to watch the stars. I promised her I would find those things again. And I did. I joined a yoga class in the village. I started helping my sister with her small shop. I smiled at strangers and found myself laughing more often. The world felt larger again. Not because it had changed, but because I had stepped out of the box I had lived in for too long. One day, I ran into an old friend from university. We had not spoken in years, but she recognized me at the market. We sat at a cafe and talked for hours. I told her everything, not in anger, just as it was. She listened, and when I finished, she said, "You are so much stronger than you think." That night, I thought about those words. I repeated them to myself, softly, like a new kind of prayer. Then came the letter. It arrived by post 3 weeks after I had left. A simple white envelope, my name written in his handwriting. I held it for a moment, unsure. My sister watched me from across the room, but said nothing. I opened it. The first line was his apology, not for the cheating, not for the silence, for waiting too long to care. He wrote about his mistakes, about the nights he sat alone in the house, about how he realized, too late, that he had broken something precious. He described memories, small ones I had forgotten, the way I laughed when I read a good book, the way I touched his shoulder gently when I wanted to ask something without words. He said he never deserved my forgiveness, but he wanted me to know that I had changed him, that he was still changing. There were tears on the paper, maybe mine, maybe his. I could not tell. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I did not read it again, because closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from the moment you realize their apology is not what you need anymore. A few days later, I went to the beach alone. The sky was clear and the sand was warm under my feet. I stood at the edge of the water, letting the waves touch my toes. I thought of all the versions of myself I had been in that relationship. The hopeful girl, the patient partner, the quiet forgiver. And then I let her go. I walked into the water, not far, just enough to feel the sea around me. I stood there for a long time, eyes closed, breathing in the salt and the silence. When I turned back toward the shore, I felt lighter, not healed completely, but whole enough to begin again. That evening, I sat at my sister's kitchen table, flipping through a small guidebook she had given me. It was about the northern villages, places with hiking trails, old libraries, and peaceful lakes. She had circled a few spots she thought I would like. I ran my finger over the page and stopped at a place called Alderfield. I had never heard of it, but the photo showed a tiny bookstore next to a stone path lined with flowers. Something about it pulled at me. I went upstairs and packed a small bag. I told my sister I needed a few days alone. She smiled and nodded. She did not ask why. She simply handed me a scarf and said, "It gets cold there in the mornings." The next day, I boarded a quiet train heading north. I sat by the window and watched the landscape change. Trees became denser, roads thinner. I felt no fear, only a strange kind of peace. Alderfield would not give me answers, but it would give me space, and maybe that was enough. Because healing is not about forgetting. It is about choosing where to go next, and finally going there without looking back. The train stopped at a small platform with no station building, just a wooden sign that said Alderfield, and a gravel path leading away from the tracks. I stepped off with my bag in one hand and the cold morning air brushing softly against my face. The silence here was different, not empty, but calm, like a place that had never rushed, never shouted. The walk into the village took 10 minutes. I passed quiet homes with ivy-covered walls and white lace curtains. The streets were narrow and clean. A man sweeping outside a bakery nodded at me. I nodded back. No questions, no attention, just space to be. I stayed at a small guest house run by a woman named Maeve. She was kind, with tired eyes and hands that smelled like lavender. She showed me to a simple room with a view of the hills and said breakfast was at 8, but only if I felt like it. That was the kind of place it was. Soft, optional, gentle. I spent the first day walking. I found a trail behind the village that led through tall trees and quiet fields. I sat on a bench by a small stream and listened to the water move over stones. I did not think of him. I did not think of pain. I let the air fill my lungs and reminded myself that being alone was not the same as being lonely. In the evenings I wrote, not about him, about the place, about the people I saw in the bakery, about the old woman who fed the birds every morning near the chapel, about the man who painted landscapes in the square and whistled as he worked. I wrote to remember that the world was still wide, still full of stories beyond the one I had lived with him. On the fourth morning, I walked into the bookstore from the photo. It smelled of paper and dust and something sweet, like old wood. The shelves were uneven, packed tightly with books of every shape and color. A bell rang as I entered, and an older man behind the counter looked up and smiled. He did not ask if I needed help. He let me wander. I found a small armchair in the corner and sat with a book of poems. I read slowly, letting each word settle inside me. One line caught me. Some things bloom again, not because they forget, but because they forgive themselves. I closed the book and sat with that sentence. Forgiving myself. Not for leaving, but for staying too long, for doubting my own worth, for giving more than I received, for hoping he would change before I had to. That evening, I stood on the small bridge at the edge of the village, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky turned orange, then purple. The air was cold on my cheeks, but I stayed until the last light disappeared. That night, I slept deeply. In the morning, I packed my things. Maeve made me tea and handed me a paper bag with a scone inside. I thanked her. She said, "You look different now. Lighter." I smiled and said nothing. Sometimes people see things you are still discovering. I took the train back not to my sister's house, but to the city. Not to return to my old life, but to start a new one. I found a small flat near the library. The kitchen was tiny, but there was a large window with sunlight in the mornings. I got a part-time job at a local art gallery. I joined a book club. I painted my walls yellow. I saw him once, months later, in a cafe across the street. He was sitting alone, looking down at his coffee. He looked older, tired. I did not go in. I stood outside for a moment watching. He did not see me. Or maybe he did and chose not to move. I turned and walked away, because the truth is, sometimes people do change. They wake up, they learn, they grow, but not always in time to love you right, and that is not your burden to carry. I still think of him sometimes, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. He was part of my story, but he is not the ending. I am. Some evenings, I walk along the riverside near my flat. The water moves slowly, reflecting the city lights like a quiet mirror. I often carry my notebook with me, not to write about the past, but to capture small, beautiful things. The way a woman hums as she walks her dog, the way a child laughs while running through puddles, the way light rests on old buildings. These moments remind me that healing does not come all at once. It arrives in pieces, in patterns, in places you do not expect. I still wear the scarf my sister gave me when I left for Alderfield. It reminds me of that turning point, the moment I chose to walk towards something instead of away. Sometimes people ask if I am single, if I want to try love again. I smile gently. Maybe, one day. But for now, I am busy loving the life I built after everything fell apart, because I am not who I was before. I am someone who stayed, someone who left, and someone who chose herself in the end. And that, more than anything, is a story I am proud